printed in House Report 112-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 112-540, offered by Mr. Quigley of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, the largest accidental marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry ravaged the Gulf Coast. We passed legislation, we convened commissions, and we swore that we would learn. Have we? I fear the answer is no, and I'm not the only one. In April of this year, the presidential panel that investigated the explosion gave the Obama administration a B, the oil industry a C+, and Congress a D for refusing to act on any of the recommendations of the Commission. The bill that stands before us today seeks to increase domestic oil and gas production and reduce regulation of the energy industry. I've said it again, and I'll said it before, and I'll say it again. Sometimes this place feels like Groundhog Day, and I am Bill Murray. So in the spirit of deja vu, I am offering an amendment today that mirrors legislation I introduced in the 111th Congress as a response to the BP oil catastrophe. The amendment would reconfigure the existing presumption that extraction comes first and conservation comes second. The measure would change our nation's outer continental shelf policy and mandate precaution from a derivative that may imply that protection of the environment is secondary to expeditious development. Declares that protection and maintenance, and where appropriate restoration, of ocean ecosystems and coastal environment is of primary importance. Makes clear that OCS leasing, exploration, and development would be authorized in limited areas of the ocean only when science shows that those initiatives can proceed with minimal risk to the health of ocean ecosystems. Protects important ecological areas, or IEAs, by requiring the Secretary to consider geographical, geological, and ecological characteristics of the OCS areas. And finally, it amends the Outer Continental Shelves Land Act to require specific precautions for areas with particular physical or environmental characteristics from OCS leasing. In the Commission's review, one of the chairmen stated, across the board, we are disappointed with Congress' lack of action. 2 years have passed since the explosion on the Deepwater Horizon killed 11 workers, and Congress has yet to enact one piece of legislation to make drilling safer, end of quote. Let us do one thing to make our public safe and to keep them healthy and to spur economic development through conservation and the creation of green jobs. Thank you, and I reserve.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, developing our nation's outer continental shelf is all about achieving a balance. The federal agencies involved have to balance the needs of the coastal community and the environment while also providing for safe energy production. This is how you preserve the multiple use aspect that we have for federal land management, and I endorse that concept. And fortunately for the gentleman, the author of this amendment, the purpose of his amendment is already the law of the land. No leasing occurs in the Outer Continental Shelf without extensive environmental assessment. Now, I'll give you an example. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management conducts an environmental impact statement, or an EIS, before leasing in any area. Then another EIS for the specific lease sale area. And then another environmental assessment must be conducted before a company can even begin development. So with that process that you have to go through, I can only conclude that this amendment is offered not about protecting the environment, but it's really about stopping offshore energy production. And of course, if we do that, obviously what does that do to American energy jobs? So I think that the gentleman, like I said earlier, fortunately all these protections exist if indeed we're going to have energy production. So I don't think we need this amendment, and I'd urge my colleagues to reject it And with that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Illinois.
Having respectfully heard the argument, I would stand on the statements we have made and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we had a discussion on this very issue in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we made very clear that the language dealing with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve did not affect existing land management policies or management policies, those policies in place to protect our resources. And so, again, we actually adopted an amendment by Chairman Dingell, Mr. Dingell, the Chairman Emeritus, to make sure that we restated that this does not change or affect our federal land management policies and those intended to protect our federal resources. So we made that clear in Energy and Commerce provisions of this bill as well. And with that, I yield back the remaining time to the gentleman from Washington.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman I understood yield back. I would not object if he asked unanimous consent to close on his side, then I will close on my side.
I close.
The gentleman yields.
Yes.
Without objection.
I'm done.
Yeah, the gentleman has time or not?
No, I've yielded back.
The gentleman from Illinois has yielded back.
He's yielded back, okay. With that then, Mr. Chairman, the arguments have been made. I urge rejection of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 5, printed in House Report 112-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from West Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in House Report number 112-540, offered by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, under this legislation, Congress creates a Transportation Fuels Regulatory Committee with the Secretary of Energy chairing the committee. My amendment is simple. It will require the Secretary and the committee during their deliberation to consult and receive input from the National Energy Technology Laboratory. If we're going to analyze and report on the impacts of the rules and actions of the EPA on our nation's fossil fuels, then we should make sure that the committee established under this legislation consults with our nation's fossil energy laboratory. NETL is our only governmental research, design, and developmental laboratory dedicated to domestic energy sources. It's only fitting that we make sure they are included in this process. NETL works with academia on over 275 projects across this country, as well as private entities, having provided over 450 projects in 2011, nearly 400 private sector projects, and over 100 not-for-profit laboratories. NETL's work in 2011 alone provided over 2,000 projects, 89,000 jobs, and over $18 billion in total funding in every state, in every congressional district. NETL's research and development into our transportation fuel sector began back in 1918 in Bartlettsville, Oklahoma, with petroleum research. In fact, synthetic gas research began at NETL in 1946. To note some other successes, NETL worked with conjunction with academia and the private industry to develop horizontal drilling in our nation's natural gas fields. Now, some say Secretary Chu, being the chairman of this committee, will consult with his own fossil energy team. Maybe that's true, Mr. Speaker, but this is the same Secretary of Energy who has worked with President Obama to slash our fossil energy research budget by 40% over each of the last 2 years. This is the same Secretary of Energy who should be promoting coal, oil, and gas, but instead makes derogatory comments such as coal is my worst nightmare. What we can do here today is ensure that the Transportation Fuels Committee and the Secretary consult with our government's fossil energy experts. If you support having input from government, private sector, and academia experts, then support of this amendment would be appreciated. Mr. Speaker, I also wish to thank Chairman Upton for his support of this, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to seek to control the time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
This amendment highlights, Mr. Speaker, the absurdity of Title II of the Republican bill. The bill will create a new government bureaucracy to conduct an unrealistic and burdensome study of several clean air rules, none of which have even been proposed. This is a fundamentally flawed approach. The scope and timing of the new government committee's analysis simply are not feasible. The bill requires a new interagency committee to estimate a host of cumulative impacts of multiple unrelated potential rules. The committee is supposed to estimate impacts on gasoline prices, capital investments, projected maintenance and operation of new equipment, refinery capacity, employment at the national, state, and regional levels, other cumulative costs and benefits, and even the overall global economic competitiveness of the United States. Since none of the rules that are supposed to be analyzed have even been proposed, this complex analysis required by the bill would be full of guesswork and assumptions. It's unclear how this new government bureaucracy could estimate the level of pollution control that may be required, predict compliance options, or assess the specified effects. Given all of the uncertainties and guesswork inherent in such an analysis, it's unclear how the committee could produce an economic analysis of the rules with any measure of credibility. EPA Assistant Administrator Gina McCarthy testified, quote, "It is unclear how the new committee would analyze rules that have not yet been proposed, or how the public could comment on that analysis in an informed way," end quote. She also noted that such analysis would be redundant and a waste of government resources, given the extensive analysis EPA already completes as part of the rulemaking process and the interagency review conducted by OMB. The bill provides an unrealistic deadline as well for completing this report. Doesn't create an additional job in the private sector. All it will do is devote taxpayers' money to create another government committee in order to provide it with the hopeless task of conducting a host of complex analysis that probably could not be completed with any credibility, even if the necessary data did exist, and the committee had years to work. So the whole thing is a pointless waste of taxpayers' money required by the bill. Now, Mr. McKinley's amendment adds some additional consultation to that already absurd requirement. The Department of Energy is already represented on this new government committee the Republicans want to establish. In fact, the Secretary of Energy chairs the committee. Mr. McKinley's amendment adds a requirement that the committee consult with part of the Department of Energy. This adds another layer of unnecessary, superfluous consultation on an already unwieldy process. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment and no on the underlying bill, and I'll yield back my time as well and urge a no vote.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from West Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in House Report 112-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from West Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 6, printed in House Report Number 112-540, offered by Mr. McKinley of West Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By the way, I'm just a little happy right now. I just got a text from my grandson, just won his baseball game tonight, 15-14. So it's a tournament he's playing in, so be nice over there now. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, once again, I'd like to reference the Transportation Fuels Regulatory Committee created by H.R. 4480. My amendment will look at the analysis that the committee will develop. One of the problems our oil and gas industry faces is the vast, ideologically motivated regulations they must endure. However, other nations do not seem to impose such overburdensome policies and regulations thrust upon them. Instead, countries in the Middle East and Asia promote their oil and gas industries and work to make it easier for these countries to get their gas products to market. This amendment would require the committee to conduct an analysis of other nations' regulations, policies, and enforcements, or lack thereof, of their oil and gas industries. Saudi Arabia, China, and India do not overwhelm their oil and gas industries with excessive regulations. They help them to thrive. This committee needs to look at what these other nations are doing to grow, stabilize, and sustain their oil and gas industries, and ultimately compare it to what we're doing here in the United States. We ought to help our industry, and make this amendment helps to show how we can improve and stop hindering development of our natural resources. Ultimately, I offer this amendment because we are supposed to be a nation leading by example over the rest of the world. With this economy and millions of people unemployed or underemployed, we really ought to be saying to our regulators, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Mr. Speaker, again, I wish to thank Chairman Upton for his support of this amendment and the opportunity to offer it here. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back to his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I seek time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. In the previous amendment, we discussed Title II of the Gasoline Regulations Act, which creates a new government committee to do the impossible, conduct an analysis of EPA air quality rules that have not even yet been proposed using data that does not exist. The interagency committee cannot possibly provide a credible assessment of the potential impact of these potential rules on energy prices. It would simply require too much guesswork. Moreover, the Energy Information Administration told our committee staff that it does not have the capability to conduct much of the analysis required by this title. The agency would have to devote significant new staff and contractor time to complete the analysis. CBO estimates that the Gasoline Regulations Act would cost $3 million to implement. That's $3 million to produce a report that will not be reliable, credible, or valuable to anyone. Mr. McKinley's amendment would make this report even less credible by significantly expanding its scope. His amendment would require that this new interagency committee examine, and I'm going to quote this, any other matters affecting the growth, stability, and sustainability of the nation's oil and gas industries, particularly relative to that of other nations, end quote. This language suggests that the new committee will have to take into account events and regulations in other countries as well as our own. Now, that's certainly going to set the price tag well above $3 million. For example, would the new interagency committee have to examine Nigerian labor law? What about oil company business practices in the Amazon, or the concerns of indigenous communities in Canada's tar sands? Will the committee have to take into account the health of Hugo Chavez and the potential impact on Venezuelan oil prices? Political upheaval in the Middle East has a profound impact on the oil market. Will the new committee have to delve into that? If the Interagency Committee was serious about examining any other matters affecting the stability and sustainability, then they would have to look at a whole Pandora's box of issues here in the United States. For example, shouldn't the committee have to examine what Congress is doing to give coal a competitive advantage over natural gas by weakening air pollution laws and blocking action on climate change? The CEO of Chesapeake Energy has been in the news lately for some questionable business decisions that have helped put the country's second-largest natural gas company on the brink of bankruptcy. Surely the new interagency committee would have to examine that issue as part of this inquiry into matters relevant to the sustainability of the oil and gas industry. All of this is to say that Mr. McKinley's amendment is extremely broad, would make a deeply flawed report even less reliable and credible, if that's even possible. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from West Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report 112-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition to offer an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report Number 112-540, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, Title II of this bill blocks EPA from finalizing several important air quality rules until after a new government bureaucracy produces a new analysis of these and other EPA actions. But it's a fool's errand, because a new government bureaucracy is required to conduct an impossible analysis of rules that haven't even been proposed using data that doesn't exist. The bill would block EPA from issuing new Tier 3 standards for motor vehicles and fuels to reduce harmful tailpipe emissions that cause smog and deadly particle pollution. Smog and soot pollution can trigger asthma attacks, heart attacks, and even premature death. The bill would block the EPA from issuing long overdue rules to require refineries to use modern technology to reduce their emissions of toxic air pollutants. The pollutants cause cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, and other serious health problems. The bill would also block EPA from issuing rules necessary for states and localities to implement the 2008 ozone standard. This would leave the outdated 1997 ozone standard in place. Even the Bush administration thought this standard was too weak. In addition, the bill would block EPA from updating the ozone standard to reflect the best available science on the health effects of breathing dirty air. Well, during the legislative hearing on this bill, Chairman Whitfield stated, quote, "It is not the intent of this legislation to roll back any existing health protections." That claim is laughable for a bill that radically changes the Clean Air Act by barring EPA from setting air quality goals based on what science tells us is safe to breathe. But if Republicans want to claim that this bill is not an attack on the Clean Air Act and public health, there should be no objection to my amendment. My amendment simply states that notwithstanding the bill's provisions, notwithstanding all that's in this bill, the EPA administrator cannot delay implementing any of the rules targeted by the bill if the air pollution that would be controlled by those rules causes serious harm to human health, including asthma attacks and other respiratory disease, heart attacks, cancer, birth defects, brain damage, or premature death. This is a simple choice between oil industry profits and Americans' health. The top 5 oil companies earned $137 billion in profits last year. They can afford to clean up their pollution. Instead, this bill would make Americans pick up the tab for the oil companies and would make Americans pay that tab with their health and even their lives. The air quality protections blocked by this bill are especially important for the most vulnerable among us, our babies, kids, old people. Oil refineries are among the largest emitters of toxic air pollution, but they are often located near where people live. But this bill would indefinitely delay EPA's ability to require oil refineries to clean up pollution, such as benzene, which causes cancer and contributes to birth defects and developmental harm in babies. Now, Republicans argue these bills would only be delayed for a while, but many of these rules have already been delayed for far too long, and the Republicans' claim assumes that the interagency committee can actually complete the impossible study required by this bill. Even if that were possible, there would still be no deadlines for these new rules, as the bill eliminates existing deadlines and sets no new ones. Americans rely on the Environmental Protection Agency to hold polluters responsible for cleaning up their pollution. It's just common sense. If you stop EPA from doing its job, public health will suffer. So it's time to come clean. If you want to pass a bill to stop EPA from doing its job and allow polluters to pollute with impunity, be honest with the American people. Tell them you think that we've done enough to reduce air pollution. Then you want to stop any further efforts to clean up air pollution. But don't pretend that this get-out-of-jail-free card for oil industry polluters won't hurt the health of Americans, especially our children and the elderly. If, on the other hand, you don't want to block efforts to clean up air pollution that is contributing to asthma attacks, heart attacks, lung disease, cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, and premature death, then support my amendment. My amendment will make it perfectly clear that EPA can continue to clean up air pollution that causes serious health effects. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. We heard a lot of powerful words there: ban, bar, block. But the fact is that this bill does not ban, bar, or block these regulations. In fact, nothing prevents, nothing bars, bans, or blocks the EPA from developing rules on their current schedule. And nothing bars, bans, or blocks the EPA from protecting the public health and the environment as the law requires them to do so. In fact, it's quite commonly known that the EPA is unlikely to even finalize these rules prior to the completion of the study. We've already got tremendous protections in current law, stringent regulations, some of which were just issued in the past few months. But I think we ought to take a look to understand what impact regulations are going to have on the cost of people's energy. Our colleague mentioned picking up the tab. Well, I'll tell you who else is picking up the tab. People in poverty are picking up the tab of increasing energy costs, making it more and more difficult for them to make ends meet, picking up the tab of rising gas prices, costing $50, $60, $70 a tank to fill up with gas to drive to work. That's who's picking up the tab. Our constituents who are trying to lift themselves up and out of poverty, having difficulty trying to make ends meet because of rising energy prices. Because this Congress refuses to enact legislation that says, hey, let's look before we leap and understand the impact this price is going to have, understand the impact these regulations are going to have on the price of gasoline. Again, the purpose of the bill is to require a study. Nothing in this bill relieves the administrator of the EPA from the responsibility to issue rules required by the Clean Air Act or any other legal obligation. Nothing in this bill changes the EPA's obligation to protect the public health. Nothing in this bill prevents the EPA from developing and proposing new regulations, taking public comments, or from preparing a final rule, a process that typically requires at least a year. In fact, it would be highly unlikely, as I said before, that they could both propose and finalize this rule before the study was finished. And our colleague also mentioned that we don't know enough information about proposed regulations to study them. Well, EPA's own action development process, the own internal ways that the EPA works, their own internal action development process requires that the analysis of a regulation start early in the rule development. And so they're already talking about what impact these have, including the President's own executive orders that require agencies to perform analysis and consider the cumulative effects of regulations. And so this is an unnecessary amendment. Our colleague mentioned that some of the most toxic emitters of air pollution, well, there's a lot of people around the country that believe the most toxic emitters of air pollution is Congress. And in this case, some of those arguments have been used in the bill on this amendment. And I would just urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. With that, I reserve my time.
Gentleman yield.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves the balance of his time.
Reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman refused to yield.
The gentleman from California's time has expired.
Yes, if his time has expired, I'd be happy to yield.
Yeah.
The gentleman yields.
There's a regulation for Tier 3 standards for automobiles that will reduce sulfur and other emissions that are very harmful. EPA's analysis says that will contribute a penny per gallon for gasoline. And that's the kind of rule that would be stopped on the existing bill. And there's an enormous health impact. For a penny a gallon on gasoline, when you talk about people in poverty, they can afford a penny a gallon, and the oil companies can afford to absorb a penny a gallon, especially with all the health and lives that can be enhanced by removing some of these very dangerous chemicals.
Reclaiming my time, and again, I'm not in a position to tell constituents who may find it tough to make ends meet that it's okay if we increase your price of gasoline by a penny here, a penny there, a couple pennies, maybe
but you
a nickel.
claim that it's going to increase it by many dollars, and I think
if the
you're
gentleman
incorrect.
would respect my time. Thank you.
His time.
We know that a penny increase in a gallon of gasoline, the Federal Trade Commission has said, can be a significant burden, meaning as much as $4 million to individuals and businesses around the country for every single penny in the increase of a price of gasoline. And again, this does not prevent the EPA from developing rules on the current schedule.
Well,
it says look before you leap. And that's why I object to this amendment and yield back my time.
Gentleman, yield on that last point.
The gentleman from Colorado yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
To Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report 112-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in House Report number 112-540, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, throughout the 112th Congress, the Republican leadership has invested a staggering amount of time and effort into gutting our nation's clean air and water protections. As of this month, this House has voted 247 times in support of anti-environmental bills, amendments, and riders, including 77 votes devoted to dismantling the Clean Air Act alone. As we debate yet another bill that seeks to gut the public health and welfare protections provided by that act, and as we witness Democratic attempts to protect public health get defeated time and again on party-line votes, one is tempted to cynically dismiss H.R. 4480 as the Republican leadership's latest offering to their good friends in big oil. However, this bill contains an interesting provision that gave me pause, frankly, since it seems to hint that disagreements over protecting public health when setting national ambient air quality standards may actually stem from fundamental philosophical differences between the two parties. One provision in particular begs for clarification, since it's not every day that Republicans starkly disagree with Justice Antonin Scalia in regard to statutory interpretation as they do in Section 206 of this bill. As written, that section would amend Section 109B of the Clean Air Act to require the administrator of the EPA to take feasibility and cost into consideration when prescribing air quality standards that are requisite to protect public health. Now, I'm aware that the author of this provision believes that this language merely clarifies supposed ambiguity in the Act, going so far as to assert during the May 17th markup, and I quote, "The only reason costs are not being considered in setting standards there today is because the Supreme Court said that the language was ambiguous." Mr. Chairman, I must respectfully disagree with that interpretation, since Justice Scalia's statutory interpretation of Section 109B was anything but ambiguous. To quote Justice Scalia, in a unanimous opinion in Wittman v. American Trucking Association, Inc., in regard to potentially considering cost when setting ambient air quality standards to protect public health, he said, and I quote, "The cost factor is both so indirectly related to public health and so full of potential for canceling the conclusions drawn from direct health effects that it would have been expressly mentioned in Sections 108 and 109 had Congress meant it to be considered." Even more to the point, the very first sentence of Justice Scalia's opinion says, Section 109B does not permit the administrator to consider implementation costs in setting national ambient air quality standards, and would seem to put aside any ambiguity. That brings us to my simple amendment. Since Justice Scalia's opinion was crystal clear, the cost cannot be considered when setting those standards to protect public health, I couldn't figure out why my Republican colleagues were so committed to forcing the administrator to take those very factors into account. But then it dawned on me that since the Clean Air Act actually never defines the term public health, perhaps there's some confusion concerning who or what comprises the public. After all, if one believes that corporations are people, then the term public health would obviously have a different meaning to that individual compared to my own or Justice Scalia's. Thus, my simple amendment would clarify the term public health in the Clean Air Act only as it pertains to the health of people and not corporations or other non-living entities. And it's a simple fix to clear any confusion and restate congressional intent. By adopting this amendment, Mr. Chairman, Congress can reaffirm the principle that corporations are not people and ensure the lack of definition for the term public health in the Clean Air Act does not cause any confusion, particularly for certain individuals who may be under the misguided impression that corporations are indeed people. I urge my colleagues to support this simple amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I believe this amendment is unnecessary. Talking about ambiguities in the law, silence in the law when it comes to the Clean Air Act and the determination of cost. Here, the issue of cost was silent, and we're simply saying we ought to have the issue of cost brought into this. When the term public health appeared in the first federal clean air legislation in 1955, its ordinary meaning was the health of the community. In the American trucking decision, as you pointed out, the Supreme Court affirmed that the definition of public health is the health of the public and does not refer to the health of non-living entities. The Clean Air Act requires that ambient air quality standards be established to protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. Nothing in H.R. 4480 changes the definition of public health. Again, let me say that. Nothing in H.R. 4480 changes the definition of public health in the Clean Air Act or any obligations. Doesn't change any obligations to set such human health-based standards. And so I would urge a no vote on this amendment. With that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Colorado yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Chairman, on that matter, I would request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in House Report 112-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 9, printed in House Report number 112-540, offered by Mr. Gene Green of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support my amendment. I'd like to vote for this bill, but it goes way too far. Mr. Chairman, I represent 5 large refineries and 20-plus chemical plants, so I'm very sensitive to the regulatory compliance can mean to a company's economic success. But for over 40 years, the Clean Air Act has required the Environmental Protection Agency to set the level of each ambient air quality standard based on what is necessary to protect public health. They do this because EPA's job is health, not economic impacts. For over 40 years, Republicans and Democrats have agreed to this principle, which was passed on a bipartisan basis in the 1970s and signed into law by a Republican president and unanimously upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2001. This amendment would strike Section 206 of the bill, which require EPA to consider industry costs when determining what level of air pollution is safe. Economic and compliance costs are already considered several times throughout the regulatory process, which is why Section 206 is not necessary. The EPA conducts regulatory impact analysis for a range of emission standards when they propose the standard. Then they do a second regulatory impact analysis when they choose the final standard before it's sent to the Office of Management and Budget for review. The regulatory process works. Last September, the Office of Management and Budget did not allow EPA to move forward with the revised ozone NOx standard because it felt that the cost of compliance would be too high for regulated industries at this point in our economic recovery. To use a Texas saying, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Section 206 is a policy ride that undermines 40 years of bipartisan agreement, and I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment and reserve my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have great respect for my colleague from Texas. We've worked on a couple of pieces of legislation together over the year and a half that I've been on the committee. I had the honor of serving with him on the Energy and Commerce Committee. But I also must rise again to oppose the amendment from our colleague from Texas. Once again, this bill, nothing in the Gas Regulations Act, stops the EPA from developing rules on their current schedule. Nothing in this prevents the EPA from protecting the public health and the environment as the law requires them to do. But as we talked in the previous amendment, consideration of the cost and feasibility of these major rules is elsewhere throughout the law, and it is warranted because in this case, a failure to consider them, those costs would hurt jobs, could hurt jobs in the economy. We need to know. In fact, costs are required in other parts of the Clean Air Act, and EPA must consider costs in the context of setting new source performance standards program, automobile emission standards, aircraft emission standards, fuel additives, and reformulated gasoline standards. And it's also a matter that you have to consider costs when setting future drinking water standards in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And if you go back and harken back last year, when President Obama decided that he was going to withdraw his last ozone rule, one of the comments that he made when he was withdrawing that ozone rule, which we argued would have greatly imperiled our economy, here's a quote from President Obama. "I have continued to underscore the importance of reducing regulatory burdens and regulatory uncertainty, particularly as our economy continues to recover." And so when the President's talking about Clean Air Acts, he recognized ozone, he recognized the importance of taking a look at our economic uncertainty and the economic uncertainty of his last ozone rule. And so I appreciate our colleague's amendment, but certainly have to oppose it at this time and urge the rest of our colleagues to oppose the amendment as well. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague from Colorado because the system does work. Even the President used economics. But that's the President's job, not the EPA. And I'd like to yield 2 minutes to our ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you for yielding to me. The Clean Air Act was adopted in 1970, signed by President Nixon. Changes were made in 1990, signed by President George H.W. Bush. The heart of the Clean Air Act has been that EPA relies on the best science possible to determine what level of pollution is harmful for people to breathe. They decide what is safe. And based on the science, EPA sets a quality standard. This is the standard to protect public health. Then they take into consideration at the state and local level the costs of how to achieve that. They may give more time. They may do it in different ways. But the Section 206 of the bill would end this common sense approach, the main part of the Clean Air Act, because it would make cost a factor in what is supposed to be a scientific decision about how much pollution is safe for a child to breathe. In setting a public health standard, it would give as much weight to a polluter's accountant as to a scientist. This is like going to your doctor, asking for a diagnosis, and he wants to tell you what your diagnosis is based on the cost of treatment. You want to know what's most important for your health. That's what's required of EPA. You'll hear over and over again Republicans say, we've done well in reducing pollution, and we have, because of a Clean Air Act that's based on setting a standard to protect health and then allowing costs to determine how to achieve that standard, but not setting the goal based on costs that could be wildly out of sync with the reality of what it would take and how much to spend to achieve that health-based standard. This is a very, very radical provision in the bill. I want to commend my colleague, Mr. Green, for seeking to strike it. It would be consistent with the law as we've always known it, not to go back and change it as this bill would do.
The gentleman's time from Texas has expired. The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, to repeat, to reiterate, to restate this point, nothing in this bill changes the EPA's obligation to protect the public health with an adequate safety margin. Nothing changes the obligation to protect the public health. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas has 1 minute.
Thank you,
one and a half minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself the balance of my time. I appreciate my colleague and your work on the committee, but that's why we need to remove 206. That provision actually takes away the health and safety as EPA's primary responsibility. That was what it was created for in 1970. We already have a system that will work to deal with economic problems. We go to OMB, but even more so, we can go to the states, because once EPA and OMB approves that rule, then they go to the states to work out the compliance mechanism. And in our district, where I have a huge industrial capacity, we actually work with our state agency and EPA to make sure we can economically do that within a time frame. That's why this amendment should be acceptable, Mr. Chairman, and I would encourage members to vote for this amendment when it comes up for a vote tomorrow. Now I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Chairman, I ask for a roll call vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 10, printed in House Report 112-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 10, printed in House Report Number 112-540, offered by Mr. Terry of Nebraska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my amendment is a rather simple one, and I hope all of my colleagues can support it. Many of us remember the devastation brought on by the hurricanes Katrina and Rita. But even more folks outside of the Gulf region remember the meteoric rise in gas prices and the threat of having no gas at all. When supplies are interrupted, it's critical to restore fuel for consumers as soon as possible. We continue to operate in an environment in which the fuel required in one market may not satisfy the requirements set by the EPA in another market, i.e. the fuel in Chicago may be different from the fuel in St. Louis, especially in the summertime. If supplies or fuel are disrupted, whether from a national emergency or from a simple equipment failure, the consumers in the affected market can be affected in a very significant and adverse way. When gas stations run out of gas, our constituents suffer. When suppliers run short of fuel and the market drives up prices, the constituents suffer. Not every supply disruption is covered in the existing statute, but every supply disruption can hurt our consumers. That is why this amendment, or what this amendment is doing, ensuring that the administrator has the authority to serve the best interests of our constituents, our consumers, when fuel prices are affected. Further, asking these consumers to wait a prolonged period of time before issuing a ruling that could restore supplies to their market is unacceptable. Time is of the essence when we are trying to avert these fuel shortages and price spikes. It's important that the decisions regarding the economic welfare of our constituents are made in a timely manner. The underlying bill that we have here before us is about doing what we can to keep the prices as low as we can. This amendment would broaden the times where EPA can grant a waiver to an area to use whatever fuel they have on hand when there is a disruption. Right now, the authority only exists for natural disasters and other larger emergencies. Not all disruptions are covered. This amendment expands upon the waiver to include any disruption. Because we have refineries closing in the Northeast and we have a limited ability to move product due to Jones Act's requirements, we need to ensure that any fuel region is never in a position of doing without fuel. The second part of my amendment calls for the EPA and DOE to conduct a fuel harmonization study that EPAC 05 directed them to complete by June 2008. And here we are in 2012, and we don't have the study. It simply tells them to get on it. We want the harmonization study completed. And at this point, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For purposes, gentleman from California rise.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition and claim the time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
This amendment would change the law, the Clean Air Act, that authorizes EPA to waive pollution control requirements for motor vehicle fuels where there's an extreme and unusual fuel supply circumstance. Well, we want that ability to waive that law, and that's already EPA is already allowed to do that. But the Terry Amendment provides that if EPA doesn't act in 3 days, it's automatically granted. And that's not enough time for EPA to act. Often a request for a waiver is incomplete. We don't know exactly why they're asking for the waiver. They haven't come up with all the information. It may not specify the area that would be covered. It may not be clear on exactly which fuel parameters are waived. So under this amendment, EPA would have to choose between two bad options. They could reject the waiver and then perhaps approve a revised version a few days later when EPA gets the necessary information. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Fuel suppliers are going to be confused. They may be concerned that EPA won't address a situation where they need some rule. Or EPA can allow an ambiguous and confusing waiver request to become effective. And again, this would just leave fuel suppliers confused and uncertain about what they have to do. Since the waiver would become effective automatically, how would fuel suppliers even find out they'd gone into effect? It's also unclear what constitutes a waiver request. I think there's a lot of confusion in this proposal. I don't know why existing law should be changed. if there's been a problem. We haven't heard any testimony on this. We haven't had any hearings on this in our committee. Requiring laws and regulations to be waived hastily based on incomplete information and for potentially long periods of time is simply bad policy. Regulations are adopted through a public process which allows all parties to participate and all relevant information to be considered. But without limits, waivers could effectively rewrite regulations without public input. That's why the Clean Air Act waiver provisions, which were adopted in 2005, are narrowly crafted. So I have a lot of misgivings about this policy. I don't know why we need it. We haven't had any testimony on it. It could lead to some very bad results, and I want to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman's remarks, but it's really not as draconian a measure as it may appear from his comments. When a waiver is requested, it's usually by a government entity for a region, usually with governors, and if there still has to be a disruption. If there's a disruption to the point where a government entity has to request a waiver from the oxygen requirements for the summer fuel for that particular region, that disruption is going to be well known and well documented. It won't take them more than 3 days to do it unless they're intentionally dragging their feet. 3 days is sufficient, and if they refuse to act on that within that certain period of time, I think it's completely appropriate that they're able to keep the blend with the supply that they would have. So this is really a simple request, a simple amendment to make sure that price spikes don't occur, that time is of a necessity, and I'll reserve unless the gentleman wants to yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, a waiver request does not have to come from a public entity. It can come from elsewhere as well. I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Markey, gentleman from Massachusetts.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is
recognized. I thank the gentleman. You know, this is just another example of Congress knows best. It's a Republican solution to everything. Let's not let the agency professionals do their jobs on a case-by-case basis. Let's have a one-size-fits-all 3-day shot clock that we put on a request that could have significant impact environmentally in an area. And by the way, if the agency's not ready, they just might reject it on day 2 because there's not enough information, rather than having an orderly process that makes it possible for the agency to be able to determine in a conversation with perhaps a government entity, but perhaps not, all of the details of what the implications, what the ramifications of this request would be. But it's no different than the shot clock you want to put on the Department of Interior in 60 days having to approve drilling in sensitive offshore or onshore lands in our country. All of these things are basically part of a Republican agenda to ensure that the hands of the government are actually tied in protecting the health and environment of our country. And what the gentleman from Nebraska is doing is just part and parcel of a systematic approach to undermine the ability of those agencies that are tasked with the job of protecting the health, of protecting the environment, of protecting the safety of individual citizens, to have handcuffs put on them so that they cannot discharge their responsibility. I urge in the strongest possible terms a no vote on the Terry Amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman from California.
We have time. We reserve it.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska. Reserves. Gentleman from California.
Ready to reserve
Both
that?
members have 1 minute remaining.
What's that? You said reserve. I'm going to close on my amendment.
I yield back my time.
Okay.
Gentleman from California yields.
Yeah, just last state, I think the rhetoric far exceeds the facts here. This is a simple amendment just to say when there's a disruption, instead of waiting around when we know there's a problem, let's take care of the problem, allow the available fuel to be used so there aren't price spikes that hurt people. So yield back. Ask that my colleagues support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Nebraska. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 11, printed House Report 11-12-540. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 11, printed in House Report number 112-540, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 691, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman